So good day, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Community Central. My name is Brian Prophet. I am with the Red Hat Open Source Program Office, and I'm pleased to be presenting to you or hosting for you another edition of Community Central. Before I introduce today's guests, I do want to do the usual housekeeping reminders. If you have a question for our distinguished speaker, I definitely encourage you to use the Q&A function that is in your BlueJeans Primetime tool. That way we can vote on questions and make sure that the most liked questions get asked towards the end of the presentation. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I am very pleased to introduce to you my colleague and friend, Karsten Wade, who is with a community architect with the Open Source Program Office here at Red Hat. Karsten's going to be talking to us today about an exciting new project, the revamping of the open source way. So Karsten, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Brian. It's fun to be back here. I haven't been on the show in a while. Yeah, so
well,
okay,
whenever
so
you're
I'm gonna
ready,
ignore
we'll
the
get
chat because that's gonna great. Yeah, I'm gonna close the chat because that'll just distract me. I'll pop it open later. So hi everybody, good day wherever you are. I'm going to talk to you about our relaunch of the Open Source Way, which is our community management community management best practices guide. And Brian is going to be driving slides for me. I'm just going to quickly make sure I've got everything I need on screen so I'm not all over the place. All right, there we go. So yeah, as Brian said, I am a senior community architect in the Open Source Program Office, and I was the original author on this book in the 1.0 range. It was a small group of us who collaborated on it. And yeah, go ahead and jump to slide 2. Thank you. Yeah, there we go. So what we're going to talk about today is I just want to give you an overview of what the vision is for this guide, what it's all about, what we're trying to do. A quick history of how we got here, because some of that is relevant, because a lot of this is about the evolution of open source software development and the best practices of how we operate these open source communities. Then talk about where we are right now, which is the really interesting bit. We are a project that's underway. We're trying to draw some attention from the right people, but not make the big splash until we're ready for our actual publishing date, which is coming at the end of the year. And then give you an idea of what's coming through this year and into the future as we develop this beyond just a single guide, but into an external community of practice. Go ahead to slide 3, thanks. So this is essentially our mission, our intention around this work in terms of why we're restarting or why we're doing a 2.0 version, and what our hopes are for the future. And when I say what I really appreciate is that this isn't, this is not just me speaking for the Open Source Program Office in that sense, or even for Red Hat, but we've quickly been able to gather a community of contributors from outside the company, and are beginning to operate as in that way. So so this vision is really holding for that group of people. And what we want to do is create a community management best practices guide for open source practitioners, and written by and from the experience of those same practitioners. So a practitioner is essentially people who get who practice something, they get it done. It doesn't mean that you're an expert. It doesn't mean that your a specific job role says that you do one thing or another. It just means that you're practicing in open source communities and trying to work on getting better at it. And then within that process, we want to foster a community practice that will maintain and grow the guide, and then materials beyond that, because that is the essence of what a community of practice does. Is it's a group of people who get together to learn and improve on the practices that they follow. So we're already starting to see materials beyond what we want to publish just in this one guide, that may be things that live in the community outside of even the guide format. Go ahead to slide 4, please. So this is just a quick history of where we were, and I can't see you offhand who's all in the watching the presentation today, but there's certainly a number of people who were around in 2009 and who were involved in our community architecture team with the 2.0 or the 1.0 release. And what we tried to do at that point was step from where we'd had the experience of always coming and talking to not just Red Hatters, but people in the open communities about how it is that we do things and what it is that practice is, but then also the why of something. And the why is a part that makes it really a best practice. And this is something that's been was an important thing that when we looked around at the landscape of what materials there was a lot of material that told people how to do something and what to do in terms of open source best practices. But it didn't really get very often into the why until you sat down with somebody and they told you a story about an experience they had or something of that sort. And that's what we found is that often the gap we were able to fill was to just to talk about the thing, but also the why the thing was important. And so that was a cornerstone of how we wanted to construct this construct the guide back then. And then you know, just in terms of starting with writing down the many things that we were repeating at the time, but then also the but then also being able to create a format so that other people who had similar stories and similar practices and experiences could come in and work with us to build a whole guide. So when we released that guide, it was incomplete on purpose with the goal of growing a community of contributors inside and outside of the company. And that was then. And it got as well as it did, and it sat for a little while because it was fine. But in the last decade, there's been an evolution in open source development practices and experiences that people have had. And one of the things that seems to have come from that as well is a lot of people come in and they don't really know the why of something. They're just familiar with the what you do. You just copy and paste this bash script and you do this thing and there you go, or you have a mailing list and you talk on it, or you have some governance, or you just do these things. And we felt it's important to capture those things, make sure everyone knows what our opinions are as a group of people on those practices, but then also the why. So that was really that history that's led us to here. Go on to slide 5, please. Thank you. So at the moment, the present, I'll bring ourselves where we are today. I'm just going to go over quickly a top level overview of the guide, what the sections are that we have, and then we can get into a little bit more detail in the next slides afterwards. And essentially what we're doing here is representing the opinion of not just Red Hat's open source program office, but a lot of people that we've worked with in open source communities that when you have a wide group of when you have a large group of users, you have the largest group that you can pull your contributor base from. That didn't come out the way I meant it to, but I hope that made sense. That you put your energy at attracting users and you lower the barriers to contributions, and people who care about the project and people who contribute to the project will come in often through that pathway. And so that's kind of the method that we've baked into the outline here. So we start with a quick overview of what we mean when we say an open source software community, and why you might want to start one and why you might not want to start one. It's not the answer to everything. And then we get into the core of the growing and creating a community, starting by attracting users. What's that all about? As users become participants, people who are excited about the project, maybe talk about it or get on the forums and answer questions and ask questions. All of these things are really important, and you need to be able to give those people venues and to guide them into being productive. And then from all of these groups come contributors, and being able to identify those contributors and all the processes and things you need to make that actually happen, keep the barriers lower, or where possible, and so forth. And then from there we get into some of the things that are really important to us if we're trying to manage an open source community is understanding when we're doing well and measuring that success, and understanding when we're running into trouble and how to respond to the troubles we run into. And so the avoiding pitfalls and learning mistakes is the other part of that, running into troubles. And we get into a number of different pieces in there, including that opportunity to tell even more why stories. So why stories will be embedded throughout this content, but we're also seeking a growing pool of relevant stories that are that are maybe applicable to different industries, so that if you were using this guide, you could pull in one of these other stories as one that would make your point better than something that was less relevant. Go on to slide 6, please. So just a quick detailed view of the outline. I have lots of learning styles in the audience, so I figure it's good to see it as well as speak it out. So I'm not, hopefully this all dials in together for you. But anyway, the beginning of this, we have, the first section of the guide is introductions, and that Community 101. For those who aren't as familiar with that, 101 terminology comes from like beginning level college courses. This is high important material, but it's the very kind of basics that you all need to have in order to get forward. Something that came up during when it came up, what I mean is getting to the quick start checklist. The reason why that's marked as new is we had a couple of events this year right before travel was restricted, and we were at FOSDEM in Belgium and at Scale in the Southern California Linux Expo in Pasadena. We held a Birds of a Feather and a writing workshop session, and it was a chance to not just attract contributors, but actually get contributions in real time. We did an overview, spent more than an hour with groups of people going over this over this outline with everyone to get their input and see what was missing. Talk to other open source practitioners, and some of the things that came out from those conversations were this quick start checklist. When a project, the question was basically, what if it's just 2 or 3 of us and we don't need all of this stuff to run an open source project? We want to make sure we're not making mistakes now that we'll pay for later by boxing ourselves in. And we said, okay, well, there must be a checklist or something straightforward that you would make sure you would do as a community, just to make sure that you weren't locking yourself into a direction that made following these best practices in the future more difficult. And then a chance to talk about some terminology and lexicon, setting the stage for the whole book, and the practice of being able to explain terminology as we go. And then we get into the sections on attracting users, describing the basics of what a project is and how we drive adoption. And there's a lot of these practices are around, like, how your website presence is. Is there a download button? Is there a quick access to help information and so forth? And then getting into guiding participants, it's really important to understand why people participate in open source, and also how participants are helpful, so that whatever the unique qualities of your open source project are, you can enable participants and guide them, so that when they're going and enthusiastically talking about your project with some people at a coffee shop, maybe they've read through some of the materials you presented them, so that they're on message. They're talking truthfully about and accurately about the project, and they feel that. They know that when they're speaking not on the behalf of the project, but they know that they're speaking from from agreed upon information. So these are things that are help really give people a sense of empowerment in terms of the project. That's important for the next part, which is, you can go to slide 7, I think, which is growing contributors. And an important part of, I think I'm supposed to be waiting to make sure. Okay, thank you. Yeah, haha, there's a lag on me. Haha, the impatience I am. So yeah, getting to growing contributors. This is often, for a lot of people, this is the really core of what they're caring about when it comes to an open source software project. If you're a community manager, like, I need contribution, I need this code base, we want to do some things with it. I'm a developer, I'm a writer, I want to make some things happen, right? We're undergoing this experience right now. This is what you and I are all doing right now. Is we are, as a group, I'm trying to help grow the contributors of this project. And because that's obviously something important, but it can't be the only focus that we have. But anyway, getting into this chapter, we want to get into some sector things to first understand what a contribution is. The it's more than code kind of thing, and then just talking about how you get organized around bringing in contributors, doing the onboarding. One of the requests that came out of the workshop, I think in the Scale workshop in Pasadena, was to talk about easy fixes all the way through to what takes experience fixes, things where you um, sorry, I'm not describing that very well. There was the idea is that people who are new contributors to your project can often can be brought in to work on easy fixes and things that will teach them about the project and teach them about the code base. And there's this concept of being able to sort of create some tiers or striation levels from there, where you might have easy fixes, but then it can't go just from easy to hard. There has to be some stuff in between that people can do. And if you can be looking at your project from an onboarding perspective with that in mind as you're filing bug reports or planning issues to track things to do. And I think that in a few minutes we're going to take a look at the Git repo for this project, and you might be able to see some of that examples of where there's some different striations of contribution possible. And then getting into community governance, what's that all about? Why it matters? What are different examples of it? These are some of these chapters are underway right now that you can take a look at. Defining community roles, which is sometimes I think what it is things that are those of us who are experienced in open source may presume that people know certain roles have to be filled, and we just want to have a chance to really get into the details on what that is. And then handling legacy code bases and dealing with code migrations. I can't remember the detail of what that one's about. I always ask that question when we come to that in the outline, like, what was that about? I'm gonna have to go back into our notes somewhere and find out what the point of that one was. Quickly, let's go on to slide 8. Thank you very much. And bring us to the last of the outline. So again, measuring success, defining healthy communities, developing that metrics plan, really understanding what that's all about. And then I think a really interesting one, this is sort of some way it's a catch-all section, the avoiding pitfalls, learning from mistakes. But as an example of something that's really important in here is one of the chapters that came out of the Birds of a Feather session at FOSDEM in Belgium was the idea of community manager self-care. And this just came up when we were presenting this outline, and an audience member raised her hand and said, I'm not, what about a section that talks about taking care of yourself and making sure that as a community manager, you're staying healthy mentally and physically so that you're capable of doing this job with all the difficulties of it. And that person who raised her hand is now actually the author on that chapter and is a contributor into the community. So that part certainly worked out really well. And yeah, sometimes that works when somebody comes up with an idea and you suggest that they write the idea. Sometimes it works and they're actually interested in it. And then there's another very interesting part of this, and this is an example of an area where we're talking about striation of contribution, in that there's a lot of people who are open source practitioners and they don't have the time to sit down and write a chapter for this book. And maybe some of you have got a time to become a reviewer of this book, and that's definitely a really important contribution that we'll be looking for as chapters are coming to the review state. But there's also people who have got a lot of really good stories, and an interviewer, who could be you, could be me, would sit down with somebody who would be one of these folks and talk for an hour or so, and tell some stories about some of, maybe look over the book and tell some stories about those. Oh, I remember the time that, this happened while we were trying to track this healthy community, and we made this mistake, and don't do that. And that just gives us that much more material to bring in, so that's useful for people who are using the book in the future, who are using the materials, whatever form that they're in. Because the same story doesn't resonate with everybody. Sometimes you need to try a different tack, a different direction. People will understand the what and the how. That's okay, straightforward. I open a mailing list and have all our discussions on the mailing list. But what's really wrong if I stop and I run into Alice and Bob at an event and we just make a decision about the software, like we're just there, it's what we're doing, right? And so then there's going to be a story in here that's going to tell that person why it is that it's important that all decisions have to be made on the open public mailing list or on the open forum and not in a private conversation in the hallway. And we're collecting those stories, sorting through them, growing that story body over the years, beyond just the publishing date. That's going to be another aspect of this community practice that's going to be growing. And that's, so again, that's just all the extra stories and all those things will be in there. And then finally, any proof and references that we'll have. So let's jump to slide 9. And I'm just going to quickly walk through and explain this authoring process and then we'll get a chance to go over and I can show you a little bit of or yeah, in the GitHub repo. So we're basically we're going to where the most open source practitioners with the experience base that we're looking for exist in that social coding space of GitHub. And we are committed to using these tools just for the 2.0 release of this guide. As a community, we've got many more things happening or potentially happening, and we'll look at that after the book is ready. So we're working in Asciidoc, and there's some particular reasons why those of us who started preferred that over others, and it's just partly because we like the tool chains. And this is how open source projects get started. 5 or 6 people sit down and say, yeah, let's do it in Asciidoc on GitHub, and there you go. That's how we are. And the other thing we really like about using the Git repo or the Git development system is that discussions about the content stay with the content. So we have a mailing list, but the mailing list is supposed to be for meta discussions and status updates and big decisions and so forth. Individual questions about what should or shouldn't be in this chapter, are best tied with that chapter. And that way, if someone's trying to understand or look at the history or any of those things, it's all contained within that particular document. You can skip slide 10 because that shows the Git repo and the workflow. Actually, what we could do now is, what I can just say, let's do this. We had to make a switch at the last minute with Brian is going to be driving for me, so I didn't think through how we were going to do this. But I will mention that we are holding open weekly video meetings that are a stand-up and office hours to follow. If anybody's interested in joining us or watching the past videos of those. But let's take a moment now and jump over to take a look at the Git repo and what's the workflow looks like, just so you can see what's in progress. And Brian, if you can switch over to it would be the third link I posted to the project board for the editorial board. So one of the great things that we were able to do, in this process was build on the success of other books and other materials that have been written. And about 9 or 10 months ago, I sat down with Brian Berenshausen, who's been working who'd done a lot of work on the Open Organization series, and one of the sorry, I just took a look over in the chat to make sure everything's still flowing fine. So one of the things that they had done was they'd used the GitHub repo for gathering, just for outlining chapters and defining what those were going to be. They didn't use it for the rest of the authoring process, but he brought this kind of robust concept here that we've developed on in the project board. And essentially just gives us, it's an editorial workflow that helps us keep track of what work that hasn't been done, work that's been assigned that hasn't been turned in yet, and then where it is in the draft and review stage. And each one of these columns is sorry, I'm having my video screen didn't switch, so I was not sure if everyone else is actually looking at the same thing that I'm talking about.
Carson, the video is being shared.
Thank you. Yeah, it didn't switch over for me. I apologize. Thank you very much. So I can't see what you're walking through. I'm just presuming and describing it. Little theater of the mind on my side. Thanks. So yeah, so each one of these columns is assigned it's sort of assigned to is owned by a group or an individual. The being in the column really defines who's in control of that piece of content, who's supposed to be working on it, whether a writer is drafting it or whether it's being reviewed by a member of the editorial team. And several of these chapters are marked as candidates for preview chapters, including there's one in draft review that should also be potentially marked as a preview chapter. And what we're planning on doing is a sort of a 1.9 release is of an early chapters or an early book preview. So we're going to preview several chapters that are going to be ready ahead of the other ones, just as a part of the way of building some excitement around the book, and also attracting more reviewers and interviewers and further like that. Yeah, and I think it's about probably the primary thing to look over at in here is just that workflow and things are and so the main thing to note here is that just is if you're coming and saying, oh, what work is there to do as a writer, that work is all in the to assign column on the far left. And then then as things move across is where the review work is going to be happening. So we're just beginning the process of we've been focusing on the call for writers, getting people who are interested in working on the content, working on a chapter together with a group of people or by themselves. Both those things are happening. But we're also getting ready to ramp up a call for reviewers, and we just need a little bit of process and some introductory content around that in order to help our reviewers be able to do things. But in essence, this is another way for people to either review the entire book or the sections of content that are most interesting to them, to see if they are, if they're complete. Basically, this is not really as much of a copy editing language review, but also things for clarity and does this sound good for non-native English readers, for example, and all those things are going to be something we want to consider in there. And yeah, and I just really appreciate, just as in terms of running a project, I do appreciate having this Git-based workflow to manage the number of different pieces coming together. It's turning out to be really nice. And there's an issue that's basically each one of these chapters has an issue assigned to it that's going to be assigned to so there's an issue per chapter, and then each chapter ties to a single Asciidoc file. So as the issue gets closed and the content gets merged, everything moves across, and it just keeps a really nice flow to manage a complex editorial task like this, particularly while still being able to use a friendly markup language instead of having to work in some kind of proprietary, right? All proprietary tool. All right. Yeah, so let's go ahead and jump on. We'll jump back to, let me jump back and finish up the presentation. Thanks. I think we're going to be at slide 12. And just to come in really quickly to let you all know who the we is and the what is and so forth, who's doing this stuff in the project. There's myself, project lead. No one else wanted the job. Brian Prophet is our lead editor. He leads the editing team, which is several of us and growing. And it's important to have somebody who has a strong editorial opinion be able to hold that, I think, separately and not have other considerations. As a project leader, I might want to lean in a certain direction because it feels to me like it's good for the project. And Brian will come back and remind us that we want to stay within this lane because it's good for the guide. And in a similar vein, Sean McCants is our lead writer, and his main probably bulk of work is going to be working with writers as content is being developed. So if you need somebody to work with in terms of you're lost or you're running on the wall or you're trying to figure out if one construct versus another will work. And Sean's also our tool specialist. So if you're interested in documentation tool chains and you want to see what we're doing and how it's being developed, Sean's is lead on that, and all of that stuff is being tracked by on one of our project boards. We have 4 project boards to track things, and technical bits is one of them. And then our editing team are all of the folks mentioned above, and we're open to adding additional editors, particularly copy editors and so forth. But I think that the review editors. There are 2 groups of editors out that are kind of sub within this: review editors, which I've already talked about, and then subject matter experts. And there are going to be a few chapters in here, for example, the community manager self-care, where we're going to want to be talking to a subject matter expert around mental health issues, for example, to make sure that we're not giving giving advice in ways that we shouldn't. Just like you would have any other technical aspect of content reviewed by subject matter experts, we want to make sure that we were go find and get those reviews for the chapters where that really matters. And then the writing team, is all the folks above, and just quickly grabbed a few people whose chapters are underway. Ashley Nicholson, who I mentioned, is working on the Community Manager Self-Care. Gordon Half's chapter on participant motivations is actually already in draft review, which is great. And Ray Pike from GitLab is working on the metrics chapter. All right, we can jump on to I think so slide 13. I probably talked about this already. How to if you're interested in participating, you go to the GitHub repo, you find the issue that you're interested in, or the chapter you want to work on. You find the issue and you put your interest into that issue. You make a comment on the issue and say, hey, I'd love to work on this, and then you'll submit your outline for that chapter into that issue as well. And if you've got broader questions, you can bring them to our weekly meeting. We can discuss them on the mailing list. If you've got some different approaches you want to take, but most of that work's been happening in the repo. So then once your outline's been assigned, like yay, you get to do it. You're going to do it the way you want to. You're going to begin working on your content in an Asciidoc in the Git Repo, collaborating with any of the writers who you've got and the lead writer, and you just work that content against the deadline. There's a detailed milestone schedule, and we're using some of the milestone tools and so forth in GitHub to help keep things on schedule. And so then there's a series of draft and review stages, and the editorial team will have your content for a while and bring it back and so forth, and we'll just keep working that towards the deadline. On to slide 14. So when your chapter is ready, when you feel like it's ready to be reviewed, to be merged into the main guide, you make a pull request. One of the editors will review the work in the course of things, and if either basically it's an editorial process. Anything that needs improvement or changes, they'll bring back to you. It depends on how much rewriting is done. If it's we can use the issue system to move back and forth who owns a particular issue, to make sure we know who's in charge of moving that content forward, who has the pen, so to speak. And this is just because we've got so much things, we want to make sure that things aren't falling between the cracks, and deadlines are sneaking up on people and so forth. So just trying to do as much as we can to make it a contributor-friendly experience. Then on to slide 15. And that's the final bit, is the editor. A member of the editing team is the person who does the final work merge into the main Git repo. And once it's in there, those chapters are finished and ready for the launch. Next slide, 16. I hate to quickly, I'll just said a whole bunch of stuff before. Basically, our release date is December 2020. So there you go. A few more details in the actual schedule. And the last thing I want to mention before let's go ahead and go on to slide 17, because I think this is an important one, and then we can get to some Q&A. One of our goals with this whole project is not just to write a really good book and have a community practice, but to follow our own best practices at every turn. And one of the important things that we all agree upon is that the kind of governance that we've described above, with an overarching project lead who's doing all these things, it's not necessarily a model that we think is the best way to make a sustainable community. And so in parallel with working on the guide, my role as a project chair lead is temporary. And one of the things that I'm in charge of is making sure it's leading the community conversation around new governance and how we want things to appear or to be in the future. And these month milestones are really, the key is that we don't, it's actually probably 12 months from now or whatever, but the key is that we don't want to change things while we're working on the 2.0 guide, but we want to do it shortly after. So we would be looking at early next year, we would be adopting a new project governance, whatever that's going to look like. So I'm not going to say what models it could be, because the community needs to discuss and decide. But that's just one of the examples of where we want to make sure that we're following our practices and moving forward. And you can go to slide 18. It's got what's interesting on there. I guess, yeah, the contributing, the mailing list, where we're having those overarching conversations are happening on a Mailman 3 list. So you can use the web form or your email client of preference to access things in there. And I think that is basically it. I think slide 19 includes my Creative Commons attribution, so you don't have to show it. Thanks. All right.
All right. Sorry, I cut that last slide out, but we'll provide the slides
You're fine.
with the video. But thank you very much, Karsten. So we've got quite a few questions. So let me just turn that machine off and we'll get right to them. So James is saying, really impressive outlay of the book. Thank you very much. Also appreciate the multiple FOSDEM experiences and inspirations from wonderful Belgium. And so his question is going to be, how are we assuring a spread of geographic coverage for this project?
That's a good question. So in terms of, so I'm going to say, when you say, I'm thinking what we're talking about is contributors, right? Because in terms of the marketing, there's two aspects. Like, how are we going to make sure that people around the world are able to use this book and use any of the materials we do? And then how are we going to have the broadest, most diverse community of contributors coming in? And well, hard work is really the answer to both of those. But essentially, in terms of getting contributors, a lot of direct connections, conversations with people are key. So what I'm doing is I'm using my relationships from the last couple of decades of doing this stuff for anybody around the world, and going to people and asking them directly, hey, are you interested in writing something? Do you know somebody in your local community that is? That's going to be, that's a pretty good group of people, but it's not perfect. So what we're really, that's part of this too, is that part of talking to other Red Hatters and talking to other people in the world is to get people to help participate in the project by spreading the word. If you know people who are interested in this kind of thing from different geographies, then help us get the word out to them and so forth. And I think and we don't currently the idea of the tool chain, just on the other similar direction as well on the user side, the tool chain is going to support localization, and so that's going to be one of those future contribution pathways is people who want to translate the guide into their local languages or translate sections of it. The guide is essentially going to be remixable. We will have kind of our curated what we think it is for the 2.0 version, but people will be able to go in and either manually, or we'll build tooling or whatever so they can pick and choose a little bit of what's in their guide. So in terms of a downstream usage around the world, we might find that some chapters might not ring true for people quite the same way, or some stories might not ring true. So being able to remix the guide a little bit so that you could bring it into an organization in a different part of the world would be part of that, attracting people there.
Okay, great. Emily asks, how do you submit to be an editor?
That's a good question. Let me ask my lead editor, Brian, what he thinks is the best way to submit to be an editor.
$5. No.
Yeah.
So I think that the process of deciding who to be an editor will be very straightforward. If you have editorial experience or you feel comfortable editing, then we will certainly have you come and join the project. So as Karsten mentioned, we have the weekly stand-up meetings. We also have a mailing list. So you can come to either one of those channels, express your interest, and yeah, we'll definitely find work for you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the mailing list is a really good, asynchronous method for stuff, and that is that's at lists.theopensourceway.org. I think the link is in chat at the top.
Okay, and then Amrita asks, to submit a pull request, what is the eligibility criteria for a contributor? So that other side of the equation,
What's the eligibility requirements? That's an interesting. I'm trying to think of what that means exactly. I mean, I guess somebody has to be of legal age where they can consent, where they can hold a copyright and consent to a contract. They have to be able to agree to the license.
Mm-hmm.
The project is covered. We have a code of conduct. We have ways to talk about how you are in the project. You got to agree to those kinds of things, and and then be able to hold a copyright and license something under that. I think that's probably the primary bits, if I'm got that question right.
Yeah.
If there's more to it, please either head a follow-up question or ask me more.
Okay.
Okay.
Stan asks or says that I have no desire to learn a new editing tool. As a reviewer, would I have to learn this new tool?
That's a good question. The we you know that we haven't actually gotten into the details of what a review process would be. It's certainly possible that we could, in order to attract and be the widest pool of reviewers, that we could provide rendered HTML pages or people could just write in their own comments on and not
Hmm.
have to necessarily go back in and use the issue tracking tool process. I mean
Yeah.
that's probably a reasonable thing to consider. So we're not forcing reviewers to learn a new tool.
Right, and I can maybe address that a little bit. So when I'm planning to edit chapters as they come through, I use the Atom text editor, which has connectivity with GitHub. So I'll just clone the repo locally, do my edits on another branch, and then push them back in, which is what I usually do when I do anything on GitHub anyway. So what I'm using Atom, but there are a number of tools that can be used locally to edit however you want, and connect back in. So as long as we're using the pull request issue model, you should be able to basically use whatever editing tool you prefer. Um, and then we'll just track it. All we're asking is that you track it through issues and make sure that things are marked accordingly when you're done with whatever stage you're doing.
Yeah, I think what it is, I'm imagining that there may be kind of two levels of where people who want to review a lot of chapters or all the content, and there may be where I'm a writer and I go to my friend and I say, hey, can you review my chapter? And that person, if they could be empowered to just do that review anywhere, but then then it's up to that writer or up to the editor to make sure that review gets back into the whole process. In the end, it's going to have to go into the into the issue tracking.
Yeah, and by the way, there are a
For
number
those
of
of us who are using
comments.
it.
Right, and there are a number of comments going on in chat right now that are sort of addressing the nuances of this because we have team members who are jumping in. So yeah, we should be set. So Arita asks again, are we following the IBM style guide?
We are that's a good question because we're not because this is an upstream community and it has not defined for itself what final style guide is going to be used. And I think a key to that, it would have to be whatever style guide we do use, it has to be 100% available to any writer, which has been a challenge with some style guides in the past, but we haven't gotten into that far into it yet. So that's an open conversation. If you want to influence that one, come join the mailing list and let's talk about it.
Exactly. And we have time for one last question, and actually it is the last question from James, who asks, on your point of possible writers, are you looking for any particular vertical? And then secondly, if we can get, say, a European government CIO to reassure contributor, contributions around possible perceived vendor bias. So I guess we're looking for more of a a more neutral contributor kind of thing is what I believe James is getting to. So to the first question, are we looking for any particular vertical as far as writers are concerned?
I think yes, in terms of not any particular vertical, but I think when it comes to the why stories, that's really where the vertical content helps. For people who really understand in my industry, this story really resonates with people. And there's a lot of work to be done in that. I think the how and the what content, those are things that we're gonna be agreeing upon as a group. If somebody comes in with a how you do something or what you do that the rest of the community doesn't agree with, it's not going to be one of our best practices. So there's a separation between the best practices we're writing about and then why you follow that best practice. And I think the power of within the verticals is going to be really key in there. And in that sense, I think particularly when it gets to the interviews, vendor bias might be welcome in the sense of like, yeah, we want to hear from a real human with their real experiences and their thing, and we'll understand because they are X person from Y company. Will readers should be experienced with knowing to know that context and what that means.
Good to know. And with that, we are out of time for questions, and we certainly appreciate everybody chiming in with some great feedback and questions in this session of Community Central. Karsten, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yes.
Great. And with that, we wrap up another edition of Community Central. We will do one more episode in this season of Community Central on May 28th, where we will be revisiting the Open Data Hub project. Join guest host Josh Burkus for that session on May 28th. Until then, be safe, be well, and have a great day.